Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Exploring Marketing Research. Chapter number 7, Part 1. That is about secondary data research in a digital age. Learning objectives for this chapter are to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of secondary data, to give typical examples of secondary data analysis conducted by marketing managers, to understand the nature of model building with secondary data. Secondary data. Secondary data is data gathered and recorded by someone else prior to and for a purpose other than the current project. The primary advantage of secondary data comes from their availability. Obtaining them is almost always faster and less expensive than acquiring primary data. So secondary data is often historical, already assembled, needs no access to subjects. Advantages of secondary data. Secondary data is inexpensive, it can be obtained rapidly, so many of the activities normally associated with primary data collection, for example, sampling and data processing, are eliminated by using secondary data. And government data is often free, that is freely available to the researcher. Disadvantages of secondary data. An inherent disadvantage of secondary data is that they were not designed specifically to meet the researcher's need. Thus, researcher must ask how pertinent the data are to their particular project. So, secondary data can have uncertain accuracy, secondary data not consistent with the needs of the researcher. So secondary data is inappropriate. Secondary data can have inappropriate units of measurement, and there can be a time period inappropriate dated for in the secondary data. Evaluating secondary data. If we look at this exhibit, applicability of project objectives one can have in the project, and if the answer for this question is yes, we can proceed, but when the answer is no, we have to stop the use of secondary data. Does the data help to answer questions set out in the problem definition? If the answer is yes, we have to proceed to the next step. Does the data apply to the time period of interest? If yes, then we have to move to the next step. If the answer is no, we have to stop it. Does the data apply to the population of the interest? If yes, we have to move to the other question. Do the other terms and variable classification presented apply? If answer is no, no need to proceed with this secondary data. But if the answer is yes, then the next question, are the units of measurement comparable? If yes, if possible, go to the original source of the data. To make sure the accuracy of the data, we have to go to the original source of the data. Is the cost of data acquisition worth it? Once again, if the answer is yes, we can move to the next question. Is there a possibility of bias? If answer is no, then we can move to the next step. Can the accuracy of data collection be verified? So these questions help you to verify the secondary data, and if you get the appropriate answer for this question, then you can proceed with the secondary data. Objectives for secondary data studies. For secondary data study, there are three objectives. Number one, fact finding, model building, database marketing. Common research objectives are for secondary data studies. When we talk about fact finding, it means identifying consumption patterns, tracking trends, etc., and model building is about estimating market potential, forecasting sales, selecting trade areas and sites, and the database marketing is the development of prospect lists, etc. So these are few examples for the use of secondary data in fact finding, model building, and database marketing. Fact finding, the first one. This fact finding is the simplest form of secondary data research. Market, for example, a market of frozen food might be interested in knowing how often frozen pizza is consumed in US. Data can be acquired from national eating trends. So fact finding can be done to identify consumer behavior, to do trend analysis. It can be done for environmental scanning. The first one is identify consumer behavior. A typical objective for a secondary data research study might be to uncover all available information about consumption patterns for a particular product category or to identify demographic trends that affect an industry. Trend analysis means marketers watch for the trends in the marketplace and environment. Market tracking is the observation and analysis of trends in industry, volume, and brand share over time. While environmental scanning entails information gathering and finding designed to detect indications of environmental changes in their initial stages of development. Model building. Model building involves specifying relationship between two or more variables, perhaps extending to the development of descriptive or predictive equations. Models need not include complicated mathematics, though. In fact, decision makers often prefer simple models that everyone can readily understand over complex models that are difficult to comprehend. For example, market share is company sales divided by industry sales. Although some may not think of this simple calculation as a model, it represents a mathematical model for basic relationship. Model building is illustrated by discussing three common objectives that can be satisfied with secondary research, such as estimating market potential for geographic area, forecasting sales, analysis of trade areas. Database marketing. Nowadays, marketers are using database marketing, but database marketing is based on the data that is acquired by the marketing department, and that data is required for practice of maintaining a customer database, and that this practice keeps the record of their customers about their names, about their addresses, about their past purchases, and about their responses to past efforts. So we will start our part 2 of this chapter with database marketing with more details. Thank you. That's all for part 1.